This past June, as TIOH's Shavuot program on reproductive justice came to an end, I stood talking with TIOH's youth group co-presidents, Sophie Dorf-Kamieni and Allie Lappin, both high school students. Was this worthwhile? I asked them about the panel conversation, which had focused on issues of abortion access and reproductive justice. Very, the two of them said, nodding. And then they began, so matter-of-factly, to talk about their thought processes of applying to colleges. You know, one of them said, when I'm looking at colleges, I have to think about what state the school's in and the laws and access that state has around reproductive health care. And guns, they added. What are the gun laws in the states? Oh, and on campus, too. And whether it's a safe state for women or LGBTQ people or immigrants or people of color, and how claims of sexual assault are dealt with, or if there's a pervasive rape culture on campus. And they just kept going. And Jews, what's the campus's climate around anti-Semitism and Zionism and Israel? And I stared at them aghast. I applied to college over 20 years ago. I never once considered any of this. True, our students' sophistication and empowerment far exceed my own at their age. I tell them this all the time. The young people of this congregation, quite honestly, amaze me. But this kind of thinking transcends agency or awareness. When I hear our Temple teens talk this way, I just think to myself, I could never have imagined that these would be the kinds of issues our kids would be dealing with as they applied to college in 2019 in America. Never could have imagined. And yet, here we are. I don't think I'm alone in feeling a sense of disbelief as to where our country and culture and discourse have landed in recent years. And when I sit or hike with you, which I do often, I hear you express these same sentiments of disbelief to me as well. I just never could have imagined this, we say again and again and again. There are two spiritual reactions to living past the edges of our own imaginings: despair or growth. These two reactions are not mutually exclusive. I think most of us have felt despair at one point or another, or often, in the past years, not to mention at other moments in our lives. And I think most of us have also felt moments of deep and profound growth. Like any seeds we plant, our reactions to reality, both the reality around us and the one within us, have the potential to sprout and to blossom and to spread. So on this second day of this new year, 5780, I'd like to invite you into an intentionally created space, a space I would like to call beyond the borders of our imagination. There's a very important story in the Talmud which speaks to the ways that we encounter new realities, especially those we do not welcome. It goes like this. Soon after the destruction of the Second Temple, Rabbi Akiva was walking with a group of other rabbinic sages. These folks were his friends and his colleagues, and they were walking toward Jerusalem. When they reached Mount Scopus, they looked out toward the Temple Mount, where the ancient temple had once stood, the former center of all of Jewish life, what they understood to be the indwelling space of God in this world. And there, where once was grandeur, lay destruction and ruins. The sages tore their clothing as a sign of mourning. They walked on. And when they reached the Temple Mount, they saw a fox running out of the area where the Holy of Holies had once been. And while Rabbi Akiva's colleagues began to weep, Akiva began to laugh. "Why are you laughing?" they asked him in disbelief. "Why are you crying?" he asked them in turn. And they said to him, "Because there are foxes prowling amidst the ruins of what we were always taught was the most sacred ground on earth. And for that reason I am laughing," Akiva said, "because now that I have seen the prophecies of destruction fulfilled, I believe the prophecies of redemption will be as well." And when Akiva's colleagues gazed upon their present-day reality, a visage of destruction, one which was beyond what they ever could have imagined would be theirs to behold, they fell into despair. And Akiva responded with laughter, with hope, with the knowledge that Jewish tradition has always taught that beyond the edge of destruction lies redemption. "I went to bed weeping, but there is a song of joy in the morning," the psalmist declares. Psychologists describe two responses to trauma. Responses which, as I said earlier, are not mutually exclusive: post-traumatic stress disorder and post-traumatic growth. In a 2017 study with US veterans, researchers found that sometimes the same people reported experiencing both post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic growth from the exact same event. And of course, this makes sense. It's logical that the same traumatic event could trigger competing emotional reactions. The stress response often led people to a decreased quality of life, while the growth response had a newfound sense of purpose and gratitude put into the people's hearts. These researchers found that one of the best ways to help people move past post-traumatic stress was to help them foster post-traumatic growth. While his friends wept for the past, Rabbi Akiva laughed for the future. Mariana Kaplan writes in The Way of Failure, "If life obeyed our plans and expectations, then life would only be as wide as our undeveloped intelligence." Rabbi Akiva and his friends, if they were being honest with themselves, knew that the ruins that they were walking in were not actually the toppled stones of a perfect edifice. Quite the contrary. By the time that the Romans laid siege to the temple in Jerusalem and ultimately brought down life along with it, the temple and the priestly enterprise had descended into rampant corruption. There were priestly abuses of power, there was infighting, and there was violence. There were long-held hierarchies that denied wealth and comfort and equality to many. What those rabbis were standing amidst were the remnants of a dream, a version of a society that had never actually been realized or fulfilled. And so we, their ancestors, have spent the past 2,000 plus years trying to build something worthy of replacing our destroyed temple. And the dream of what it could have been, the dream that the rabbis held onto as they stood amidst its rubble. By our origins, our impulses, and our definition, we are a people based in post-traumatic growth. In 1787, when our nation's fathers, all of them white men, stood together in a room and penned the words of the Constitution that would come to define our country, they began with the words, "We the people." But they didn't really mean all of us. In fact, the people included in its promisee of justice and liberty and security and welfare and defense, well, that people excluded many of us. People of color, women, Native Americans. So many of us were not considered citizens in the enterprise that became the United States. And despite emancipation, and the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, despite Brown versus the Board of Education and Loving versus Virginia and Obergefell versus Hodges, there has always been a belief in this country that only some of us are meant to belong, that only some of us count and only some of us are worthy. And so if we do indeed stand amidst our civic ruins today, they are much the same as our rabbis, the ruins of a dream. A dream that lulled us into believing that racism and misogyny, blatant discrimination and anti-Semitism were no longer present-day problems. Michelle Alexander says that a new nation is struggling to be born, a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, egalitarian democracy in which every life and every voice truly matters. And those of us working for human dignity and freedom, we are not the resistance. We are a part of a revolutionary river ushering in a new age. This is why many activists are calling for a new America, one which is based in inclusivity and a broad definition of we and we the people. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, a Black queer Zen priest, teaches, "I'm already we. No one needs to let me in. How undignified to fight for things that are already mine. We are being asked to fight for what is already ours." What has been destroyed in our lifetime is the idea of who we thought we were, of who we imagined ourselves to be, not what actually was or is, or indeed, what should and could be. The gift of this moment, this time beyond imagination, is our opportunity for societal growth. This is actually what I wake up thinking every morning. God, don't let me waste this moment. When I first heard Reverend Angel talk about us building a new America together, I admitted to her that once I really stopped to think about it, I had come to see the Constitution as somehow being a sacred text, something similar somehow to Torah. It turns out I'm not the only one. In her book, These Truths, Jill Lepore has an incredible depiction of this print from 1800, which depicts Washington holding a constitution like a tablet etched in stone, and he's surrounded by angels trumpeting in a new era of freedom. Of course, the Constitution was not handed down from heaven. It is neither Torah nor 10 Commandments. The Constitution was handed to us by flawed men who made the grave decision not to include the word slavery in its articles, despite the fact that slavery was practiced cruelly and against theirs and our most fundamental values. The freedom it promised was a mirage. There is, though, actually a freedom we gain when we walk amidst ruins and when we name them as such. Once we can admit that that which was is now gone, that that which we hoped would be is not, then we can start building. The author, Rebecca Solnit, whose work I love, she wrote, "Whenever I look around me, I wonder what old things are about to bear new fruit, what seemingly solid institutions might rupture, and what seeds we might be planting now, whose harvest will come at some unpredictable moment in the future." Friends, there are foxes scampering in our midst right now. And it's time we start laughing so we can grow something better around us and within us. In fact, we Jews have been in training for this moment for over 2,000 years. We know how to build a wonderful, more inclusive, thoughtful, and loving community. We know how to build life beyond the borders of our imagination. Our country needs us right now for this reason and so many others. But our work doesn't stop here. Actually, it might not even start here. David Jaffe teaches that in order for us to change the world, we have to first change ourselves. He calls this approach changing from the outside in. It's the other side of the coin I've been flipping this morning. If our country and perhaps our world isn't what we thought it was, if we can admit that we're in the rubble, then it stands to reason that we ourselves in our own lives and experiences might yet emerge beyond the boundaries of our own personal imaginations as well. Perhaps we are the rubble. This is the work of tshuva, of returning, of saying to ourselves once a year, let's reset, not to our idealized selves, but toward the selves that we might yet become. When people reach out to me for pastoral counseling, our conversations often rest on the same bedrock of loss. I just never imagined. I just never imagined things would turn out this way. I just never imagined things in my life would be like this. I just never imagined something like this could happen, or I would feel like this, or we get to this place. When we walk in ruins, whether they are the ruins of a dream or what we had known, the ruins of what we had expected or what we wanted, we have two choices. We can despair or we can grow. Rebecca Solnit talks about how after a disaster, we imagine that people fall apart. And sometimes they do. But also, they fall together. These holy days, these are days for falling together, for leaning into community, for recognizing and naming our blessings, for expressing gratitude, for creating a space of renewal and reconstruction. In his book, The World Could Be Otherwise, the Zen priest Norman Fischer tells the story of the French surrealist poet Robert Desnos, a Jewish man who was part of the resistance during World War II. Desnos was captured and sent to a concentration camp. One day while in captivity, a truck arrived to drive Desnos and a number of his fellow prisoners to the barracks, from the barracks toward the gas chambers. And if there was one thing that prisoners and the guards had come to know about these trucks, it's that they always left full and they always returned empty. And so on that day when the truck stopped in front of their gruesome destination, the typically inexplicably jovial Nazi guards fell silent. And the prisoners were silent too. The silence was thick. It was the quiet of impending death. And then out of nowhere, a prisoner broke the silence. With great and boisterous fanfare, he grabbed the hand of the man next to him, and he lifted his palm toward the sky, and he began to read the other man's palm. "I'm so excited for you," he explained. "You're going to live a very long life. You're going to have 3 children, a beautiful wife, wealth. So fantastic, so wonderful." And just like that, something broke open. One after another, the men started grabbing each other's hands, and they were reading the futures on them. Big, bold futures. Each reading offered first in bewilderment and then in exultation offered another story of a beautiful life, one of love and peace and promise. And more remarkable than this, Fischer explains, was the effect all of this had on the guards. The guards, who had been agents of cruelty and murder and violence day in and day out, saw something shatter around them. They saw life, and they saw hope. And the guards were undone. What was real and what wasn't, what was absurd and what wasn't, what were they supposed to do now? And left beyond their imagination of what was supposed to be, The guards led the prisoners back onto the truck, and they delivered them back to their barracks. And that day, the men were saved from execution. I want to be transparent with you. When I first read this story, I didn't like it. I knew it would end up in this sermon, but I didn't want it to. Once I read it, I shut the book and then I tried to ignore it. But the story kept coming back to me and I dreamt about it. What is this supposed to teach, I thought? That we can change our course of history with absurd actions? That somehow concentration camp prisoners could change their fate? God, what about the other 6 million? Is this just another way of blaming innocent victims for their own deaths? The thing about this story, though, is that it's not a fairy tale. You know, Dano died of typhus a few days after liberation. But the story survived. The story was passed down as lore, but it's also real. And that's the thing about pushing past the limits of our imagination, I realized. It can often be uncomfortable. I find the story uncomfortable. And I also just keep coming back to it. The joyful disruption of the man's actions in the midst of despair, the community rallying around him, the impact one person can have on everyone around them, the way a shifted reality is able to emerge. The action here is so bold and yet so small. And it's a peaceful expression, and one also of profound protest. Of course, this is a sacred story. It's one that reflects on the human spirit, and it's a sad story, and it's an uplifting one. Could this memory passed down from generations past actually contain everything I want to say to you today? Each of us has two palms, and the stories our hands can hold and the realities they can contain and the hope they can grasp at, so much of that is actually not up to us. It is indeed beyond our imagination and beyond our control. And there is a freedom in that. Like foxes rubbing up against our ankles in the ruins. You can't think everything up, Rabbi Sheila Weinberg said to me. Some things you just have to allow. When those men read each other's palms, they had no idea what of it would come true. The futures they were speaking were all so far outside of what they ever could have imagined possible, it was all just fantasy. The future was not written on their hands, but in their willingness to transcend reality and possibility and imagination. What our hands might hold, or what our futures will offer up, is often not up to us, but making space within our hands. That is to say, setting down our burdens and expectations, breathing and noticing just the here and now, lifting our palms upward in a gesture of receiving. These are the acts that we can control. Just last week, we shipped off 62 care packages to TIOH college students who are spread out across the country. I like to imagine them opening their packages and setting the holiday contents on their desks, placing them along their books and their ideas. These students are all already settled onto their campuses, likely including the very ones that our youth group presidents, Sophie and Allie, are just beginning to imagine for their futures. They are quite literally beyond imagination. The world may change or stay the same around us, and we just keep pushing past what we ever could have envisioned. And actually, this is kind of wonderful. And so in this new year, I pray that we all might gaze on our lives and see lifelines etched with meaning and depth, with community and love, with purpose and prayer, and that we might feel some ground beneath our feet and know that it is solid. And even if we don't know where it might lead, we can still move forward. So finally, I suggest that we might take the hand of the person next to us and know that when all else fails, that hand is there to hold us and to journey with us, to discover new realms and new years, and to lead us towards something we could not have ever even conceptualized. Shana Tova.